Shall Route Part 1, The Ghost of the Road. Route 45, which stretched for hundreds of kilometers through wild forests and abandoned villages, was one of those roads that locals tried not to drive on at night. Stretched like a thin thread, it flowed through gloomy fields and inhospitable hills, shrouded in eerie legends. Anyone who has ever driven on this highway at night has reported strange occurrences, sudden fogs, strange sounds coming from the forest, and sometimes even visions. Drivers have recalled strange silhouettes of people they saw in the reflection of their headlights, but who disappeared as soon as they approached. However, most of these stories were just rumors that were passed from mouth to mouth until something truly eerie happened. Part 2, Disappearance. One autumn day, when the night was covering the world in thick darkness, a young couple, Alexei and Katya, drove onto Route 45. They had just finished their vacation and were returning home to a small town not far from the highway. Alexei, a confident driver, was sitting behind the wheel, listening to soft music on the radio, and Katya was dozing in the passenger seat. The night was calm, only the headlights cut through the thick fog that suddenly hung in the air. Alexei did not pay any attention to it. He had already driven along this road many times and knew that in autumn the highway was often shrouded in fog. But this time something was wrong. Suddenly the radio crackled, as if something or someone was interfering with its signal. The music stopped, and instead a strange whisper came from the speakers. Alexei tried to tune the radio, but nothing helped. The whisper became louder and clearer. It seemed to be coming from inside the car. "Do you hear that?" he asked Katya, but the girl was still asleep, lulled by the monotonous noise of the road. When he looked back at the road, he saw a figure in front of him. It appeared suddenly, as if it had come straight out of the fog. Alexei turned the steering wheel sharply, trying to avoid a collision, but the car, as if it had lost control, slid off the road and got stuck in a deep ditch. Katya woke up from the blow, looking at Alexei in fear. "What happened?" she asked, looking around. "An accident," Alexei answered briefly, not yet fully understanding what had happened. The image was still in his head, that figure on the road. Who was it? He was sure he had seen a person. "We need to call for help." Katya reached for her phone, but found that there was no connection. At that moment, Alexei noticed that the fog had become even thicker. It completely enveloped the car, preventing even the nearest trees from being seen. They both got out of the car, hoping to find someone or at least understand what was going on. But as soon as they were outside, they were both overcome by a strange feeling. It wasn't just fear. It was a feeling as if something invisible was watching them from deep within the fog. Part 3. The Endless Highway. The couple decided to follow the road in the hope that they would find help or at least see a passing car. But with every step they took, they felt that the road around them was changing. In the distance, the outlines of road signs were barely visible, and they were somehow wrong. They looked old, worn by time, although Alexei remembered that they used to be new and bright. Hours passed, but not a single car appeared. They walked along an empty road, trying to find at least some salvation. Soon, Katya stopped, breathing heavily. "Alexei, we should have found at least a village a long time ago. This highway is not that long." But the road ahead continued to stretch like an endless ribbon, and there was not a single sign of life ahead. Only fog that did not subside, and silence that pressed on the ears. They stopped in front of another road sign that seemed familiar to Alexei. He came closer and suddenly realized it was the same sign they had passed an hour ago. The road somehow closed, as if they were going in a circle. "It's impossible!" Alexei exclaimed, looking around. But Katya already realized that something had gone wrong. At that moment, they both heard a noise, a sound reminiscent of heavy breathing. It came from somewhere in the fog, as if someone was hiding next to them. Part 4. The Uninvited Guest. Alexei and Katya froze listening to the strange sound. It was pitch-black night all around, and only the heavy breathing coming from the fog broke the deathly silence. It sounded closer, then further away, as if an invisible hunter was circling around them, choosing the moment to attack. "Do you hear that?" Katya asked in a whisper, her voice trembling with fear. "Yes," Alexei replied, clenching his fists as if that could protect them from an invisible threat. He took a step forward, trying to see something in the thick milk of fog, but visibility was almost zero. Katya grabbed his hand. "We need to get back to the car. We can't just stand here and wait." They both began to back away slowly, keeping their eyes on the direction from which the breathing was coming. Each step echoed loudly in the emptiness, as if they were moving through an empty, endless hall. But the further they went, the stronger the feeling became that something was following them. As they were about to reach the car, the fog suddenly began to move, as if a living thing were enveloping them from all sides. Dark figures flickered on the edge of their visibility, shapeless shadows that stirred and moved too quickly to be seen. Suddenly, Katya stopped and covered her mouth with her hand, trying to suppress a scream of horror. In front of them, on the road, stood a man. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His face was hidden by a hood, and his arms hung lifelessly at his sides. But the most eerie thing was that this man did not move, did not stir. He just stood there, as if watching them from behind his hood. "Who are you?" Alexei shouted, hoping that it was just a random traveler stuck on the highway, like them. There was no answer. The figure continued to stand motionless like a statue, and the mist around it moved as if alive, forming strange swirls around the feet of this stranger. Katya took a step back. "Alexei, we need to leave. This is not a person." But Alexei did not move. He seemed to be enchanted by this figure. He could not look away. A thought flashed through his head. This is the same silhouette that he saw on the road before the accident. Suddenly, the figure slowly raised its hand and pointed towards the forest. "He wants something from us," Alexei whispered, not taking his eyes off the stranger. Katya grabbed his hand and pulled. "Please, let's get out of here before it gets worse." Her voice trembled, and her hands could barely hold it. But at that moment, the figure disappeared. It simply dissolved into the fog, as if it had never been there. The forest around them froze, and the strange breathing that had been following them stopped. There was a dead silence. Part 5. Forest of the Dead. "What was that?" Katya whispered, squeezing Alexei's hand. "I don't know, but I think we need to find out what's going on here." He pointed to the forest, Alexei said, as if in a trance. "Are you serious? You want to go there?" Katya looked at him with horror. "We have no other choice. We're going around in circles on this road. What if he was trying to show us something? Maybe there's a way out, or help." Katya shook her head, but she saw the determination in Alexei's eyes. "Okay," she finally exhaled. "But if something goes wrong, we'll come back right away." They headed towards the forest, where the figure was pointing. The fog thickened around them, growing thicker as if trying to keep them on the road, but they kept going, not looking back. An unnatural silence reigned in the forest. Not a single sound of insects, not a single rustle of animals. Only their own steps and rapid breathing broke the oppressive silence. The trees around were tall and old, their branches intertwined, forming strange patterns, like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. They went deeper into the forest, and soon the fog began to dissipate. But instead of relief, a new wave of fear swept over them. Strange objects began to appear between the trees, old, rusty cars covered in moss, as if they had been there for decades. Most of them were wrecked, as if in serious accidents. Katya approached one of the cars, examining it with alarm. It's exactly the same make of car as ours," she said, looking around nervously. Alexei looked closer and noticed the same thing. The car looked like theirs, but as if from another time. The sedan stuck among the trees was exactly the same model. Even the license plate seemed familiar to him. But that couldn't be, because their car was still on the highway. "It's impossible," he breathed. But before they could figure it out, they heard a muffled sound, like someone moaning or crying. It came from the depths of the forest, beyond the rusty cars, and was barely audible, but distinct enough to make the blood run cold again. "We have to leave," Katya said firmly, grabbing Alexei's hand. "This place is cursed." But Alexei didn't want to retreat again. It was as if an invisible force was pulling him further, forcing him to explore. He turned to Katya, but she was no longer looking at him. Her gaze was fixed ahead, and her eyes were wide with horror. "Alexei." "Look," she said, pointing with a trembling finger towards one of the cars. There, between the trees, stood the same figure as on the road. Only now it was much closer, and its face was beginning to emerge from under its hood. It was not a human face. It was distorted, as if time and space had warped its features.
Part 6 and the Labyrinth of Ghosts. Katya turned pale. Her eyes were filled with pure terror as she saw the twisted figure slowly moving toward them, as if it were reaching out from the other world. Alexei could hardly look away. Something about this creature riveted his attention, as if it knew how to play with his mind, how to manipulate his fear. "Let's run!" Katya pulled him by the hand, pulling him out of his stupor. Alexei finally tore his gaze away from the figure and ran after Katya, not looking back. The forest around them was a nightmare. The dense vegetation and darkness made the trees seem to be moving, their branches reaching out like bony hands toward the fugitives. Their every move was accompanied by ominous rustling sounds and quiet groans emanating from all around. Figures, shadows of people, or what had once been people, flickered at the edge of their vision, making their hearts beat wildly. Katya could hardly hold back her tears. Her breathing was ragged with terror. Alexei, although he was scared, understood that to stop now would mean signing his own death warrant. The feeling that they were being followed was becoming unbearable, as if the shadows in the forest could squeeze them in their cold embrace at any moment. Finally, after a long run, they broke into a small clearing. The fog began to recede, and before them appeared something that made their hair stand on end, an old, half-ruined house. Part 7. House on the Edge of Madness. The house looked abandoned, but there was something unsettling about its dark windows, as if someone or something was watching them from within. The crumbling walls were covered in moss and mold, and the roof was full of gaping holes. Despite its appearance, it had a strange pull, like a beacon for lost souls. Katya stopped abruptly and looked at Alexei. "We can't go in there, it's too dangerous." But Alexei, sweating, peered into the house, feeling a strange fog clouding his consciousness. "We have no choice," he croaked. "We're not safe outside. And here, maybe we can at least find shelter for a while." Katya shook her head, but there was a desperate determination in her eyes. They knew that there was no point in continuing to run. The forest was trapping them, and the shadows were everywhere. Holding back their fear, they moved towards the house. The door was slightly ajar, and when Alexei touched it, it creaked open with a terrible sound, letting them into the darkness. Part 8. Web of the Past. The inside of the house was even more frightening than the outside. Rotten floorboards creaked underfoot, furniture was scattered as if there had been an old fight, and the air was filled with the smell of dampness and something unhealthy and sweet, as if the house had absorbed all the horrors of the past. On the walls hung old paintings, dusty and covered in cobwebs. Alexei noticed something strange in one of them. He came closer and froze. The portrait depicted a man, an exact copy of the distorted figure they had seen in the forest. His face, despite his old-fashioned clothes, was exactly the same, stretched and distorted, as if reality itself refused to accept him. "It's him," Katya breathed, looking over his shoulder. "Something very bad happened here." They walked around several rooms, but each one only raised more questions. Everything here looked as if the tenants had left the house in a terrible hurry. But they left behind traces of their madness: overturned chairs, broken mirrors, broken dishes. On the second floor, they found something strange: a calendar that had stopped at a date from almost 10 years ago. The last date written down was circled in thick red as if it had some significance. "What happened here?" Katya asked in a whisper. Alexei didn't have time to answer when he heard that same sound again. Heavy breathing, much closer this time. It was coming from behind the wall, as if there was someone else in the house. Part 9. The secret of the house. There's someone there. Alexei exhaled, feeling his heart pounding wildly in his chest. Katya pressed herself closer to him, and they slowly walked toward the source of the sound. Their footsteps echoed loudly in the empty corridors, and their breathing became louder. When they reached the end of the corridor, Alexei noticed another door. It looked different from the others, massive, ancient, as if hiding something important. He carefully opened it, and a narrow staircase leading downwards appeared before them. From below, from the darkness, came that same breathing. "We can't go there," Katya whispered, her voice on the verge of hysteria. "We have no choice," Alexei replied, feeling a chill run through his body. They started to descend. The stairs were steep, and each step was accompanied by a loud creaking sound. When they reached the basement, they saw something completely unexpected. The room was filled with old things, as if other people's lives were kept here. There was a huge wardrobe in the corner, and children's toys were lying on the floor, dusty and forgotten. But the most terrifying thing was that in the middle of the room, on the floor, there was an old mirror. It was covered in cracks, and a strange light was coming from its surface. Alexei came closer and saw his face in the reflection, distorted and stretched, like that figure. "Don't look at it!" Katya screamed, but it was too late. Alexei froze, as if in a trance, his eyes wide open. The reflection began to move slowly, as if the copy of Alexei was alive and preparing to break out. At that moment, a voice came from the darkness. It was quiet, almost a whisper, but every word echoed in their minds. "You came late." Part 10. Dark Secrets. Katya rushed towards Alexei, trying to tear him away from the mirror, but his hands seemed to have grown to its surface. She pulled it with force, and at that moment the mirror exploded into 1,000 fragments, flying around the room. Alexei fell to the floor, breathing heavily and unsteadily. They're everywhere," he whispered, looking in horror at the shards that continued to reflect his distorted face. Katya hugged him, trying to bring him to his senses. But when she looked at the doors leading outside, she saw that they were slowly starting to close, as if the house itself had decided to lock them in forever. "We have to leave, Alexei, now." Katya pulled him to his feet, and they rushed to the exit. But the figures they had seen earlier in the forest were already moving towards them from all sides.